Cold Creek, Idaho. The 11th of January, 1979. The thermometer nailed to the porch post outside Hollister's General Store read 42 degrees below zero at 4 o'clock that afternoon, and the wind coming down from the Sawtooth Peaks carried a sound that the old-timers said belonged to the dead. It was a sound like a freight train passing through a tunnel that had no end. It was a sound that pressed itself flat against the windows of every house along Main Street looking for a way in. It was the kind of sound a mother does not forget, no matter how old she gets, no matter how many summers come after. In every one of those houses, the families were burning through their winter wood piles 3 times faster than any year they could remember. Old Mrs. Peterson, who was 76 years old and had lived alone in the same little blue house on Bitterroot Street since her husband Frank had passed in '68, had already burned her 2 kitchen chairs and was eyeing the cedar hope chest at the foot of her bed. Inside that chest was her wedding dress and her dead son's baby blanket and a stack of letters from her sister in Norway, and she was beginning to make her peace with the idea that all of it might have to go into the stove before morning. The Hendricks boys, who were 19 and 17, and were trying to keep the house warm for their grandmother while their father drove a truckload of cattle south to the railhead, were chopping up their grandfather's old walnut bookshelf in the backyard, swinging an axe in the gathering dark. Across town in a small frame house on 3rd Street, a woman named Hannah Reeves was 23 years old and 8 months pregnant and rationing pine logs by the hour, watching the small orange flame in her hearth the way she would later watch over her first child, as though her looking at it was the only thing that kept it alive. But 2 miles north of town, halfway up the south face of Mount Wapiti, in a wide natural cavern carved into the mountainside by 10,000 years of patient water, a woman in a thin cotton blouse was watering her tomato plants. Her name was Sigrid Marston. She was 38 years old, a widow, and the people of Cold Creek had called her many things over the past 18 months. Crazy, cold, the cave woman, the mountain witch. They had laughed at her in the aisles of the general store. They had whispered about her in the pews of the Lutheran church. They had told their children, half joking and half serious, that if they did not behave, they would be sent up the mountain to live with her. And the night that the great blizzard of '79 came roaring down out of Canada, like the wrath of God himself, every single one of those people would owe her their lives. This is the story of how that happened, and the story of why she built the cave in the first place, and the story of a little boy in a photograph that nobody in Cold Creek had ever seen. If you have ever been the quiet one in a room full of people who thought they knew better, stay with me tonight. This one is for you. Sigrid had been a Navy hospital corpsman 2nd class. She had served 4 years attached to a SEAL team out of Coronado, California, and she had seen things in the Eastern Mediterranean in the spring of '75 that she had never told another living soul. She was tall for a woman, 5'9", with ash blonde hair she wore in a loose braid down her back, and pale gray eyes that had a way of going somewhere else when a person spoke to her too long. Her hands were strong and scarred. Her shoulders carried something heavy. She moved through the world the way wounded animals move through deep snow, slowly, deliberately, never wasting a single step. Beside her, in the cave that afternoon, sat her daughter, Astrid. Astrid was 12 years old, with her mother's pale gray eyes and her father's dark hair, and she was kneeling at the edge of the trout pond, scattering feed from a tin cup. The pond was a shallow basin Sigrid had hand-carved into the stone floor of the cavern, fed by a copper pipe that ran from a natural spring deeper in the mountain. The water inside it held a steady 54 degrees Fahrenheit year-round summer and winter alike. 6 rainbow trout swam in slow, lazy circles beneath the surface. Astrid had named every one of them. The biggest was Hjalmar, after a character in a book her grandmother had given her in another life. And lying at Astrid's feet was the third member of the household, a 3-year-old German shepherd named Odin. Odin had a thick black saddle across his back, tan legs, and amber eyes that watched the cave entrance the way a soldier watches a horizon. Sigrid had bought him as a puppy from a retired Army K-9 handler in Boise the same week she signed the deed to her great-grandfather's land. Odin had never barked without a reason in his entire life. When he made a sound, you listened. When he went still, you watched. The cave itself was a wonder, though almost nobody in Cold Creek had ever seen the inside of it. It ran 40 feet deep into the mountain and 24 feet across at its widest point. The ceiling arched 14 feet over Sigrid's head at the entrance and tapered to a gentle slope at the back wall. Along the eastern wall ran the planting beds, 6 long boxes of dark, loamy soil, each lit from above by 400-watt grow lamps that Sigrid had wired into a small bank of car batteries charged by a Jacobs wind generator on the ridge above. Spinach, romaine, cabbage, kale, thyme and rosemary and sage in clay pots she had thrown herself on a kick wheel her father had built her when she was 11. Tomatoes, climbing strings tied to the rafters of a small wooden greenhouse frame she had built from salvaged barn glass over the course of 3 patient months in the autumn of '77. Behind the trout pond against the long curving back wall stretched the heart of the whole operation. Sigrid called it the Setesdal Bench after the valley in southern Norway, where her great-grandfather Henrik had been born. It was an earthen bench 18 feet long, 3 feet wide, and 14 inches thick, packed from a mixture of red clay dug from the riverbank, fine sand sifted through a window screen, and chopped straw cut to 2-inch lengths with a pair of sheep shears. Hidden inside the bench ran a series of clay flue pipes that connected to a small firebox no larger than a tool chest set into the stone wall at one end. When Sigrid burned 4 split lengths of lodgepole pine in that firebox, the heat traveled slowly through the flue pipes baked into the 1,200 pounds of packed earth and radiated outward for the next 14 hours. The cave held a steady 68 degrees Fahrenheit through the bitterest mountain winter on less than a single armful of wood per day. It was a technique her great-grandfather Henrik had brought with him from the Sami villages of northern Norway in 1908 when he was 23 years old and seasick and frightened and carrying everything he owned in a single canvas satchel. He had taught it to Sigrid's grandmother, who had taught it to Sigrid's father, who had taught it to Sigrid on the long summer evenings of her childhood in the kitchen of their farmhouse outside Boise, drawing diagrams in the dust of the barn floor with the broken off end of a hay fork. Earth remembers warmth, child. Stone forgets nothing. That was what the old man had told her again and again until the words had burrowed so deep inside her she could hear them in her sleep. Earth remembers warmth. Stone forgets nothing. Build into the bones of the land, and the land will hold you up. On a small wooden shelf carved into the stone wall above the Setesdal bench just at eye level sat a single framed photograph. A boy 8 years old, blonde hair sticking up in the back the way boys' hair does when they have just woken up. Wide blue eyes. A gap where his front tooth should have been. He was laughing at whoever was holding the camera. He was laughing the way only a child laughs, the kind of laugh that comes from a place inside you that the world has not yet found a way to close. His name was Bjorn. He had been Sigrid's son. and he had been dead for 3 years, 11 months, and 4 days. She walked down the mountain that afternoon with Odin at her left knee. She needed lamp wicks and a fresh box of penicillin tablets and 4 yards of mosquito netting she planned to stretch over the planting beds to keep the cabbage moths out come spring. Astrid stayed home with a chemistry book and the trout and a kettle of birch bark tea simmering on the small wood stove by the entrance. The walk took Sigrid 40 minutes down a switchback trail she had cut herself through stands of lodgepole pine so thick the snow beneath them was still spotted with old red needles from October. The town of Cold Creek sat at the bottom of a long, shallow valley. 412 souls in 1979. A single paved street. A Lutheran church with a white steeple that needed paint. A feed mill. 2 bars, the Wapiti and the Stope, a volunteer fire department that ran 1 truck and 1 pumper, and the general store, which had been the heart of Cold Creek since 1893. The store was owned and run by a woman named Margaret Tollefson. Maggie, everyone called her. She was 62 years old, with silver hair cut short against the back of her neck and kind blue eyes behind small wire-rimmed spectacles. She had moved to Cold Creek from St. Paul, Minnesota 18 months ago, almost exactly the same week Sigrid had arrived from Coronado. The 2 events were not unrelated, though only one woman in the valley knew that yet, and she was carrying the secret of it close to her chest, the way a woman carries a small wounded bird. Sigrid pushed open the door of the store, and the little bell above it rang twice. The warm air inside smelled of coffee and pipe smoke and the dry, sweet dust of grain sacks. 3 men sat around the cast-iron stove in the back, the way 3 men had been sitting around that stove every weekday morning for as long as anyone in Cold Creek could remember. The biggest of them was Walter Hollister, 55 years old. The cattle rancher whose great-grandfather had founded the store in 1893 and whose own grown sons now ran 600 head of Black Angus on the flats east of town. Walt had a gray walrus mustache and a heavy build going slowly to fat, and a voice that carried clear across any room he entered. He was not a cruel man exactly. He was simply a man who had never in his life met a thought he did not immediately speak out loud. His wife Eleanor, who was the patient sort, had once told the minister that living with Walt was like living next to a foghorn that loved you very much. The second man was Leland Crowder, 42. Tall and thin and bony, with sandy hair gone to early gray and a permanent crease between his eyebrows, like the mark left by a thumb pressed too long into clay. Lee had owned the only garage in town for 14 years. 3 years ago, a new Texaco station had opened out on the highway and taken every drop of his business with it in a single quarter. He had been picking up odd jobs ever since his pride, a little smaller every season. The bottle in his bottom desk drawer, a little emptier every month. The third was a younger man named Garrett Pemberton, 24, a logger up at the Wapiti timber camp. Garrett was freckled and red-haired and easily led. He laughed at jokes he did not entirely understand because he had learned growing up the youngest of 7 brothers on a hard-scrabble place outside Chalice that laughing was safer than thinking. When Sigrid stepped inside, Walt looked up from his coffee and grinned beneath his mustache. "Well, look here, boys," he said, loud enough to fill the room. "The widow has come down off her mountain. Must be the world is ending." Garrett snickered into his cup. Lee did not look up. Sigrid did not look at them. She walked to the counter where Maggie was already reaching beneath the glass for the small brown paper sack of items she had set aside. "How are the tomatoes, dear?" Maggie asked quietly. "They are well," Sigrid said. Her voice was low, and even with the faintest trace of the Norwegian her grandmother had spoken in the kitchen of her childhood. 3 new flowers on the Brandywine. The Cherokee purple is still slow. Maggie smiled. There was something in the smile that did not match the smallness of the moment, a tenderness too big for tomatoes. But Sigrid did not see it. Sigrid almost never saw it. Maggie had been very careful for 18 months that she should not. I heard, Walt was saying behind her, half to Lee, half to the room, that she is growing fish up there, in a cave, like a cave woman. Next thing she will be painting mammoths on the walls. That widow is digging her own grave, Lee said into his coffee. Boys, Maggie said sharply. But her voice did not carry far. It never did. Maggie had spent 62 years learning to make herself small in rooms full of men, and even now, when she had the right to be larger than any of them, the old habit moved her tongue before her courage could catch up. Sigrid placed 3 folded dollar bills on the counter. She did not turn around. Odin, sitting at her left heel, did not even glance at the men. He had been trained to ignore the foolish. But as Sigrid bent to pick up the paper sack, the inside pocket of her wool coat shifted, and for half a second something slipped half out. The corner of an old photograph, the edge worn soft from years of being touched. A child's smiling face, gap-toothed blonde. Maggie saw it. Her hand on the counter went very still. Her eyes filled with something that had been waiting 18 months to come out, and she pushed it back down with the practiced strength of a woman who had been pushing things down her whole life. "Take care, dear," Maggie said. Sigrid nodded, once tucked the photograph back into her coat, and walked out into the cold. If you have ever pretended not to hear what someone said about you, just to keep the peace, leave me a heart in the comments. I see you. I have done it too. We were taught, women of our generation, that being good meant being quiet. It is a hard lesson to unlearn. Across the street, in a small frame house with a sagging porch and a screen door that had not closed right since 1974, Rebecca Quincy was lying on the living room couch under 3 blankets, shivering so hard her teeth were knocking together. She was 40 years old, dark-haired and pretty in a worn-out kind of way, a widow herself for 14 months. Her husband, Dan, a logger, had been killed by a chainsaw kickback in the woods above Stanley on a clear morning in November of '77. The strep throat that had been going around the elementary school had finally caught her 2 days ago. Her fever that afternoon was 103.2. In the kitchen, her older son was making her a cup of tea with the last of the honey. His name was Tobin Quincy, and he was 18 years old. Tobin was tall, 6'2", with his father's broad shoulders and big, rough hands. He had quit school the previous spring when his father died, taken a full-time job at Lee Crowder's old garage doing tire work and oil changes, and he carried the weight of the family now the way young men do. Silently. Badly. Alone. He was good with engines. He was bad with words. He loved his mother and his little brother in a way he had never once said out loud, the way men in his family had not said such things going back 4 generations. His little brother sat at the kitchen table watching him. Caleb Quincy, 15, slight and pale brown hair flopping into his eyes round wireframe glasses he had inherited from his father after the funeral. Caleb was the smart one. Caleb read everything. He had read every survival book in the Cold Creek Library twice, all the back issues of Popular Mechanics his Uncle Jack sent up from Twin Falls, and a battered copy of the Foxfire book that his father had given him for his 11th birthday. He knew how to start a fire with a magnifying glass. He knew the temperature at which exposed flesh begins to freeze. He knew that afternoon, watching his older brother stir honey into a cup of tea for their feverish mother, that they could not afford to take her to the hospital in Sun Valley, that the country doctor in town would not come out for less than $40 cash, and that they did not have $40 cash. They did not have $9. But Caleb had also heard 3 weeks ago at school from a boy whose mother worked at the feed mill that the widow up in the cave on Mount Wapiti had been a Navy nurse during the war, and that she kept medicines up there, and that maybe if a person was polite about it and brought something to trade. Caleb did not say any of this to Tobin. Tobin would have forbidden it. Tobin had told him 1,000 times since their father died that there was a way men handled things and a way men did not handle things, and asking for help was not one of the ways men handled things. Caleb finished his glass of milk. He kissed his mother's hot forehead. He told his brother he was going to bed early because his head hurt. He was not going to bed. The first flakes of the blizzard of 1979 began to fall at 4:17 that afternoon. By 6 o'clock, the wind had picked up to 30 miles an hour. By 8 o'clock, the temperature on the porch of Hollister's General Store had dropped from 2 below zero to 21 below in less than 2 hours. By 10 o'clock, the visibility on Main Street was 8 feet and falling, and the National Weather Service out of Pocatello was on the AM radio every 15 minutes, telling everyone in the Sawtooth Valley to stay indoors and pray. If you have ever sat through a storm like that, the kind that makes the windows rattle in their frames and the dog whine at the door, take a second right now and tell me where you were. I would love to know. Down in the comments, there is something about a real winter storm that puts you back in your own childhood, in your mother's kitchen, in the smell of bread and the sound of the wind, and I would love to know where the storms find you. Up in the cave on Mount Wapiti, Sigrid had banked the firebox of the Sadistal bench at 9 o'clock, kissed Astrid on the forehead, and was sitting on the warm earth at the back of the cavern reading a 6-month-old issue of National Geographic by the soft glow of the grow lamps. There was an article in it about a man in Maine who built houses out of stacked tires packed with dirt, and Sigrid was reading it slowly, the way she read everything with her finger tracing the words. Astrid was already asleep in her cot, the blue wool blanket pulled up under her chin, her dark hair spread out on the pillow. Odin lay at Sigrid's feet, his great head on his paws. At 11:47, Odin's head came up. He did not bark. He did not whine. He simply stood, and his ears tipped forward, and he looked at the cave entrance with a focus so absolute it made the small hairs on the back of Sigrid's neck rise. Sigrid set down the magazine. In 4 years with the seals, she had learned that a working dog's silence is more useful than 10 radios. Odin had heard something that the wind had not yet brought to a human ear. "Show me," Sigrid said. Odin crossed the cave in 6 bounds and disappeared through the heavy canvas curtain that hung across the entrance against the cold. Sigrid pulled on her parka, her boots, her wool watch cap, and her insulated mittens, took the heavy 4-cell flashlight from its hook by the door, and followed him out into the storm. The wind hit her like a wall of fists. The temperature had fallen, she would learn later, to 38 below zero with a wind chill that the meteorologists in Pocatello could not actually calculate because the formulas of the day stopped at 60 below. The snow was not falling. It was flying horizontally in long, ragged sheets like a curtain being torn over and over again. Visibility was less than 10 feet. The sound was not the sound of wind. It was the sound of 1,000 engines, of 1,000 throats screaming at once, of every ghost the valley had ever made coming down off the mountain together. Odin's paw prints, already filling in, led her down the slope. She found the boy at the foot of a snow-bent lodgepole pine, about 60 yards below the cave entrance, curled into a ball against the trunk, with his bare hands tucked into his armpits. He was wearing a denim jacket and a pair of canvas sneakers. His lips were the color of the sky just before sunrise. He was conscious, barely. In the pocket of the denim jacket, Sigrid would find later, was a folded piece of notebook paper. In a neat boy's handwriting in pencil, it read, "Mrs. Marston, my mother is very sick. I heard you have medicine. I have a pocket knife to trade and $12. Please, Caleb Quincy." Sigrid did not read the note then. She lifted the boy in her arms. He weighed almost nothing, 92 pounds at most. She carried him back up the mountain into the warm yellow light of the cave, with Odin running circles around her ankles the whole way. Inside, she laid him on the Sedisdal bench. She stripped off the wet jacket and the soaked sneakers. She wrapped him in 3 wool blankets. She put a hot water bottle against his belly and another at the small of his back. She put 2 more under his armpits. She rubbed the soles of his feet between her warm hands for 15 minutes without stopping. She made him drink, sip by sip, a cup of water that had been warmed only slightly because she knew from her training that hot liquids on a hypothermic core can stop a heart faster than the cold itself. Astrid had woken and was watching with enormous eyes from her cot. Odin had laid himself across the boy's legs, his thick, warm body pressed close. After 20 minutes, color came back into Caleb's lips. After 40, he opened his eyes. "Am I dead?" he whispered. "No," Sigrid said. He looked around the cave. He saw the grow lamps. He saw the green leaves of the spinach. He saw the trout sliding through the clear water of the pond like silver knives. He saw the gap-toothed boy in the photograph on the shelf, and his fevered mind, half believing he had died, decided the boy in the photograph was an angel that had come to meet him. "My mom," Caleb whispered. "She is sick. Her fever is 103. Sigrid was already at her medicine chest. The chest was an old steel ammunition box, painted olive drab that she had brought back with her from Coronado. Inside were things a Navy corpsman knows how to keep. She took out a small brown glass bottle of penicillin tablets and a glass ampule of dexamethasone. She set them on the bench. "Your mother will have these by morning," she said. "But not tonight. Tonight you stay here. Tonight no one goes out in that storm." "My brother," Caleb whispered. His eyes were filling with tears. "My brother is going to find I am gone. He is going to come look for me." Sigrid was very still. Then she went to the cave entrance, pulled back the canvas curtain, and listened to the storm. This is the first interactive pause. If you were Sigrid Marston that night, if you had a half-dead boy on your bench and his brother out somewhere in a 38 below blizzard, would you go back into that storm? I want you to think about it. I want you to tell me in the comments what you would do, because what Sigrid did next is the reason any of this story has a happy ending at all. Down in Cold Creek at exactly 11 minutes past midnight, Tobin Quincy opened his little brother's bedroom door to check on him and found the bed empty and the window unlatched. He stood there for a long moment looking at the empty bed. The curtain moved very slightly in the cold air coming through the open window. The sheets were turned back. There was a piece of notebook paper on the pillow with the word "Mom" written on it in pencil. And beneath that a single line that Caleb had crossed out so hard, he had nearly torn through the paper. Tobin ran. He ran to the kitchen and he wrote a note for his mother on the back of an envelope. Mom Caleb gone out, I will find him. T. He pulled on his father's old Filson Mackinaw coat, the one his father had been wearing the morning he died, the wool still smelling faintly of pipe tobacco and engine grease 14 months later. He put on his work boots and his leather work gloves. He grabbed the heavy steel flashlight from the kitchen drawer. He did not put on a hat because in his panic, he forgot. He went out the back door into the storm. Tobin Quincy was 18 years old, 6'2", 210 pounds, with the lungs of a young man who had spent his summers chopping firewood for 50 cents a stack. In ordinary weather, he could have walked from his back door to the edge of Cold Creek in 10 minutes. In the storm, he made it 11 blocks before he lost the road completely. He turned what he thought was north toward the river path that led up the mountain. He was wrong. The wind swirling between the buildings had spun his internal compass without his knowing it. He was walking northeast on a diagonal away from the river and toward a place locals called Devil's Notch. A narrow rock cut where the old logging spur descended 30 feet between two granite shoulders, invisible in summer beneath a tangle of buckbrush and in winter completely erased by snow. At 12:47 in the morning, Tobin Quincy stepped off into nothing. He fell 22 feet and landed badly. His right tibia broke clean through the skin just above the boot top. He did not scream. There was no breath in him to scream with. He lay on his back in the snow at the bottom of Devil's Notch, the flashlight still gripped in his hand, and he watched the snow falling into his open eyes, and he thought very clearly, I am going to die here. He did not lose consciousness immediately. That was a mercy and a curse both. For nearly 30 minutes he lay there alone in the dark, and he thought about his mother, and he thought about his little brother, and he thought about his father who had died in the woods above Stanley 14 months ago, and he made a small private peace with the idea that he was about to go and join him. He even smiled a little at the end. He thought of his father's face. He thought, well, I will see him soon. Then mercifully, he passed out. Back in the cave, Sigrid was putting on a second pair of wool socks. Caleb was watching her from the bench, half wrapped in blankets, his face tight with fear. You cannot, he whispered. I can, Sigrid said. You will die out there. She looked at him then. She looked at him the way she had looked at very few people in the last 4 years. And she said something to him she had not said out loud to another human being since the spring of 1975. I had a son, she said. His name was Bjorn. He was 8 years old. He got sick while I was overseas in the spring of 75. Meningitis. By the time the Navy got word to me, by the time the helicopter could get me off the ship, by the time the plane could fly me across the ocean, by the time I made it home, he had been gone 4 days. They had already buried him without me. She was quiet a moment. The fire in the firebox made a small, soft sound. His father died 11 weeks later, she said. A classified operation in the Mediterranean. I never even saw the body. The Navy gave me a folded flag and a sealed envelope I am not allowed to open. I came home from one funeral I missed to another funeral I was not permitted to have. That is when I left the Navy. That is when I came back to my great-grandfather's land. That is when I started to dig. Caleb began to cry silently, the way boys cry when they have learned that crying out loud does not help anything. I have spent every day since then, Sigrid said, asking what kind of mother lets a thing like that happen, and I have not found an answer. But I know this. I know that somewhere out in that storm tonight, a boy is looking for his little brother. and I am not going to sit in a warm cave and let that boy die. Not tonight. Not on the same mountain where I am still alive. She put on her parka. She slung a rescue toboggan over her shoulder, a long, light sled of wood and canvas, the kind the Forest Service used. She put 6 chemical hand warmers in her pocket and an emergency space blanket and her medic's kit. She put on a second wool watch cap over the first and tied a length of climbing rope around her waist with a careful bowline knot her great-grandfather had taught her when she was 9. "Odin," she said. "Find." The dog rose. He went to the cave entrance. He put his nose into the wind. And then he was gone. And Sigrid was gone after him. And Caleb and Astrid were left alone in the warm yellow light of the cave, listening to the storm. That was the first night of the blizzard of 1979. There were still 6 more to come. The wind that night was measured at 78 miles per hour at the Stanley Airfield before the gauge froze solid and stopped recording entirely at 3 in the morning. Snow accumulation in the Sawtooth Valley over the 7 days of the storm would eventually total 47 inches on the level and over 12 feet in the drifts. The temperature at its lowest on the morning of January 14th would reach minus 47 degrees Fahrenheit at the Cold Creek Post Office, a record that still stands in Custer County to this day. 67 people died across 4 counties of central Idaho in those 7 days. 3 of them were children. 16 were elderly. Most of them froze to death within 100 yards of their own front doors, lost in the white blindness of the storm, unable to find the houses they had left only minutes before. The youngest was a 4-year-old girl in Mackay who slipped out the back door looking for her father. The oldest was an 81-year-old retired teacher in Chalice who had walked half a mile to her sister's house and gotten turned around 20 feet from the porch. Her sister found her in the morning sitting upright against the rose trellis, her shopping bag still in her lap. But Tobin Quincy did not die. Because 47 minutes after Sigrid Marston stepped into the blizzard with her dog and her toboggan and the grief of 3 years and 11 months and 4 days, Odin stopped at the edge of Devil's Notch and lay down and refused to move. And Sigrid, who had learned to trust him in a way she had not trusted any living creature since the war, dropped to her hands and knees in the snow and crawled to the edge and pointed her flashlight down. The beam caught a boot. She rappelled into the notch using the length of climbing rope she had brought for exactly this kind of need. The break in Tobin's leg was bad. The bone had punched through the skin, and there was frostbite already starting in the exposed flesh. But the wound had not bled heavily because the cold had clamped the vessels shut. That was the only reason the boy was still alive. Sigrid worked in the dark in the wind in a cold that hurt her hands through 2 pairs of wool mittens. She splinted the leg with 2 pieces of ash branch she broke off a fallen tree and a strip of canvas torn from the toboggan. She wrapped the exposed bone with a sterile dressing from her medic's kit. She got Tobin onto the toboggan. She climbed back out of the notch using the rope and a pulley system she rigged to a pine trunk with a length of webbing and 2 carabiners she carried in her parka pocket because old habits do not die. She hauled him up after her, 1 terrible foot at a time, with Odin standing at the top of the rim, watching her, with his amber eyes shining in the flashlight beam. Then she pulled him 3/4 of a mile through the storm uphill in the dark to the cave. She lost feeling in her left hand somewhere around the halfway point. She would not get it back for 11 months. There would be days, even years later, when she would still drop a coffee cup or a pencil without understanding why. Her doctor in Boise, an old veteran himself, would say to her, "You paid for that boy with your hand, Mrs. Marston." And she would say, "I know it. And it was the cheapest thing I have ever bought." She got him to the cave. When she pulled back the canvas curtain and dragged the toboggan into the warm yellow light, Caleb Quincy screamed his brother's name and threw himself out of the blankets and across the cave floor, and Astrid stood very still with her hands pressed against her own mouth, and Odin shook the snow off his coat and walked to the trout pond and lay down beside it as if he had only been out for an ordinary evening walk. That was the first night. By dawn of January 12th, Tobin Quincy was sleeping a clean morphine sleep on the Setstall bench, his leg properly set, and splinted the wound cleaned and packed and dressed. Sigrid had drained 2 ampules of dexamethasone into his thigh muscle to control the swelling. She had warmed him slowly the way her training had taught her to warm a cold core casualty, never fast, never with direct heat, always from the trunk outward. By 8 in the morning, his core temperature was back to 97.3, and he had stopped shivering and the gray had begun to leave his face. Caleb sat beside him the whole night and held his hand. He did not let go even to eat. Astrid brought him soup in a chipped enamel cup, and he ate it one-handed with his brother's fingers still in his. At 9 in the morning, Sigrid took the brown glass bottle of penicillin tablets and the second ampule of dexamethasone, and she wrote out instructions on a piece of butcher paper for Caleb's mother, and she told Astrid to put on her boots. "You and I are going to town," she said. "In this," Astrid said. "The wind has dropped to 40. The visibility is a quarter mile. We have a window of perhaps 3 hours before the second front comes in. We are not going to leave that woman to die of a treatable infection while her boys are in our cave." Astrid put on her boots without another word. The walk down the mountain took them an hour and 10 minutes. They hauled the empty toboggan behind them in case they had to bring Rebecca Quincy back up the mountain on it. The wind was bitter, but no longer murderous. The snow under their snowshoes had crusted to a hard pack you could almost walk on without sinking. The sky was the color of old pewter. The cold burned in Sigrid's left hand even through 2 pairs of mittens. They did not have to carry her. Rebecca Quincy was alive when they reached the little frame house on the corner of 3rd and Bitterroot. Alive but burning with fever alone, terrified half out of her mind with worry over her missing sons. When Sigrid Marston walked through the kitchen door of that house and into the living room and knelt beside the couch and said, "Mrs. Quincy, your boys are both safe. They are in my cave on the mountain, and I am here to make you well enough to come home to them," Rebecca Quincy began to weep. She wept for the boys. She wept with relief. And then she looked up through her tears at the face of the woman kneeling beside her, and she made a small sound in her throat that was neither a word nor a sob, but something stranger than both. "Siggy," she whispered. Sigrid went very still. "Siggy Bergen," Rebecca whispered. "Is that you?" Bergen had been Sigrid's name before she had married Eric Marston. Nobody in Cold Creek knew that name. Nobody in Cold Creek should have known that name. But 16 years ago, in the autumn of 1962, 2 girls had started the nursing program at Boise General Hospital on the same Monday morning. They had been assigned as roommates in the student dormitory on the 3rd floor of the old brick building behind the chapel. They had been best friends for 2 years, through anatomy and physiology, through their first deaths on the cardiac ward, through the heartbreak of Sigrid's first failed romance with a medical student named Theodore, and the quiet joy of Rebecca's engagement to a young logger from Stanley named Dan Quincy. They had drifted apart only when Sigrid had enlisted in the Navy in the spring of '64, and Rebecca had married her logger and moved up to the sawtooth, and the letters between them had grown shorter and then stopped the way letters always do. "Becky," Sigrid whispered. The two women looked at each other for a long moment. 16 years passed between them in the space of one breath. The dorm room with the radiator that knocked. The night they had stayed up till 4 in the morning studying for the pharmacology final. The afternoon they had walked along the Boise River, and Rebecca had cried about Dan, and Sigrid had held her hand and promised that everything would be all right. And it had been, for a while, it had been. "Becky," Sigrid said again. Her voice broke a little on the word. Then she said very quietly, "I am going to give you a shot now, Becky. And then I am going to make you a cup of tea. And then I am going to carry you up that mountain on a sled if I have to. Because your boys are waiting for you." She did not have to carry her. Rebecca was able to walk slowly, leaning on Sigrid's shoulder. Astrid carried the medic's bag. They made it back to the cave just as the second front of the storm rolled in over the ridge, a wall of gray cloud so thick it swallowed the sun in 3 minutes. By that evening, the entire valley was buried. And by the morning of January 13th, the third day of the storm, the woodpiles in Cold Creek were beginning to run dangerously low. The first to come up the mountain was a man named Frank Delaney, 51 years old, a neighbor of the Quincy family. A retired millwright who had heard from a woman at the post office that Sigrid Marston had been seen walking Rebecca Quincy up the south slope of Mount Wapiti the morning before. Frank Delaney was a hard man and a practical one, and he had 3 grandchildren in his own house and 7 sticks of pine left in his woodbox. He came alone on snowshoes, and he knocked on the canvas curtain at the cave entrance with the heel of his mitten. Sigrid pulled back the curtain. Frank Delaney looked past her into the cave, and his weather-beaten face went slack. He had been expecting he would tell his grandchildren later a hole in the ground and a stove and maybe a coffee pot. He had not been expecting what he saw. He saw the grow lamps and the green leaves of the spinach. He saw the trout pond reflecting the yellow light. He saw Rebecca Quincy sitting on a warm earthen bench drinking soup with her 2 sons. He saw a 12-year-old girl reading a book to a German shepherd. He saw on a small wooden shelf a photograph of a gap-toothed boy. He took off his hat. "Mrs. Marston," he said. His voice was rough. "I would not ask. I would not ever ask. But I have grandchildren." "Bring them up," Sigrid said. "Bring your wife. Bring whoever else needs to come. The cave will hold us all." Frank Delaney went back down the mountain. He brought his wife Edith and his daughter Carol and his 3 grandchildren back up that afternoon. By nightfall, the Peterson family of 5 had joined them, including old Mrs. Peterson, who had finally been talked out of burning her hope chest. By dawn of the 4th day, 12 more people had arrived. By the evening of the 5th day, when Walter Hollister himself came stumbling up the south slope of Mount Wapiti with his wife Eleanor on his arm and his pride in his coat pocket, there were 23 people sheltering in the cave of the widow they had laughed at for 18 months. Walt stood in the entrance for a long time without speaking. He looked at the warmth and the green leaves and the trout and the long earthen bench where families were sitting wrapped in shared blankets. He looked at Sigrid standing at her medicine chest, checking a child's ear with the small chrome otoscope she had carried home from Coronado. He took off his hat. "Mrs. Marston," he said, and his voice was not loud now. It was not loud at all. "I have been a fool." Sigrid did not look up from the child's ear. "Come in, Mr. Hollister," she said. "There is room on the bench." He came in. Lee Crowder came in behind him. Garrett Pemberton came in last, his red hair white with snow, and his freckled face streaked with cold tears he was trying to hide. He had walked 4 miles in the storm, carrying his elderly mother on his back. She was 78 years old and weighed 94 pounds, and she was alive. Barely. Sigrid put the old woman on the warmest part of the bench. She put hot water bottles at her feet. She made her drink warm broth a spoonful at a time. Garrett Pemberton sat on the floor beside his mother and put his head against the warm earthen bench and shook with silent crying. Astrid brought him a cup of birch bark tea without saying anything. He took it without looking up. Lee Crowder did not say a word for the first 2 hours he was in the cave. He simply sat by the firebox and watched the small flame the way a man watches a thing he has just begun to understand. After a while he stood up and walked over to the woodpile, picked up an armful of split pine, and quietly fed the fire. Then he looked at Sigrid across the cave and gave her a single nod. She nodded back. That was Lee Crowder's apology. It was the only one he ever made, but it was enough. That night around 11, a young woman named Hannah Reeves went into labor. She was 23 years old. It was her first baby. Her husband Daniel had stayed behind in their little house at the edge of town to keep the pipes from freezing, and he did not know his wife had gone into labor 3 weeks early. Hannah had come up the mountain with her mother Linda and her younger sister Joanne, planning to wait out the storm and go home and have her baby in March. The baby had not planned to wait. Sigrid delivered the child at 3:42 in the morning of January 14th, 1979, on the warm earthen bench of the Setesdal bench by the light of a kerosene lamp with 23 witnesses and 1 German shepherd. It was a girl, 7 pounds, 2 ounces, pink and screaming and perfect. Hannah Reeves named her daughter Sigrid. Sigrid Hannah Reeves. The baby would grow up to become a pediatric nurse in Boise, marry a man named Eric Lindgren, and have 4 children of her own. She is alive today. She is 45 years old this winter, and every January 14th, she calls her mother on the telephone, and her mother tells her the story of the night she was born in a cave on Mount Wapiti during the Great Blizzard of '79. That same morning, while Hannah was still holding her new daughter and weeping with joy and exhaustion, an older woman knelt down beside Sigrid Marston at the trout pond where Sigrid was rinsing her hands in the cold spring water. It was Maggie Tollefson. Maggie had walked up the mountain alone in the storm the previous afternoon. She had not asked to come in. She had only stood in the entrance and waited until Sigrid had seen her, and then she had said, "I am here to help if you will let me." And Sigrid had let her, and Maggie had been folding blankets and pouring soup and rocking other people's babies for 19 hours straight without taking off her coat. Now at the edge of the trout pond in the gray hour before dawn, Maggie put her old hand on Sigrid's young one. "There is something I have needed to tell you for a long time, daughter," Maggie said. Sigrid looked at her. "My name was not always Tollefson," Maggie said. "It was the name of my second husband, a good man dead now 11 years. My first husband's name was Marston, Bjorn Marston. He died in Korea in 1951. We had 1 son. He was 3 years old when his father was killed. I raised him alone in St. Paul. He grew up tall. He grew up brave. He joined the Navy when he was 19. He met a beautiful Navy nurse from Boise the year he turned 25, and he loved her with his whole heart, and he married her. And they had 2 children, a boy named after his grandfather, and a girl named for the morning star." Sigrid's hand went very still beneath Maggie's. "My boy is Eric," Maggie whispered. "Was Eric your Eric? I am Astrid's grandmother, and Bjorn's, and yours daughter, if you will have me." The cave was very quiet around them. Somewhere the new baby made a small newborn sound. Somewhere Odin sighed in his sleep. "I came to Cold Creek 18 months ago," Maggie said. "The same week you came. I did not tell you because I did not know if you would want me. I did not know if you had any room left for grief. I have watched you from across the counter of that store for a year and a half, daughter. I have watched my granddaughter grow an inch and a half. I have priced the seed packets so low I have lost money on every one. I have waited for you to be ready." Sigrid put her face in her hands. She did not cry the way young women cry. She cried the way a woman cries who has not let herself cry for 3 years and 11 months and 7 days. It came up out of her like something breaking open at the bottom of the sea. Maggie held her. Astrid, who had been pretending to sleep on the bench a few feet away, opened her eyes and saw her mother weeping in the arms of the kind old woman from the general store. And Astrid understood, without anyone explaining it, exactly what had just happened. She got up and she walked across the cave and she sat down beside them and she put her small arms around both of them at once. That was the morning of January 14th, 1979. This is the second interactive pause. I want to ask you something. Is there a piece of wisdom, a recipe, a saying, a way of doing things that came down to you from your mother or your grandmother, or someone who raised you that you wish you had written down before they were gone? Tell me in the comments. Tell me what it was. Tell me their name. That kind of knowledge is the thing this whole story is about. The things our grandmothers knew. The things they tried to teach us when we were too young to listen. The things we would give anything to ask them now. The storm did not break for 3 more days. The cave settled into a kind of rhythm that none of the 23 people inside it had expected. In the mornings, Sigrid and Astrid would tend the planting beds and the trout pond, while Maggie boiled water for porridge on the small wood stove. The children, 6 of them all told, would play quietly on the warm bench in their stocking feet the way children play when they have been told to be good and are trying very hard. Frank Delaney, who turned out to be a fine carpenter, repaired the leg of a kitchen chair that had been broken since '76. Walt Hollister, of all people, sang Norwegian Christmas carols he had not sung since his own grandmother had taught them to him in 1928. He had a clean tenor voice that nobody had ever heard before, not in church, not at the bar, not anywhere. Eleanor Hollister wept the first time he opened his mouth and let it out. She had been married to him for 34 years and had never known. Lee Crowder taught Tobin Quincy as he lay healing on the bench how to read an engine block diagram from memory. Tobin, who had not let his pride speak a word to Lee in 3 years, listened. They talked about cars for 6 hours one afternoon. By the end of it, Lee had offered him an apprenticeship at the garage Lee was going to reopen as soon as the snow melted, and Tobin had said yes, and both of them had pretended their eyes were not wet. Garrett Pemberton's mother survived. He sat by her on the bench for 5 days, holding her small dry hand. On the 3rd morning, she opened her eyes and looked at him and said, "You are a good boy, Garrett." And he put his face down against her shoulder and shook for a long time. When she fell back asleep, Sigrid came and sat beside him and said, "She will live. You did the right thing carrying her here." And Garrett Pemberton, who had been one of the men laughing in the general store 18 months ago, said, "I am sorry, Mrs. Marston. I am so sorry." And Sigrid put her good hand on his red hair and said, "You are forgiven, son." And on the fourth night, when Walt began to sing again, Garrett moved closer to the bench. He had never sung in his life. He had spent 24 years being the youngest of 7 brothers, the one who was told to be quiet, the one whose voice did not matter. But Walt's voice was something he had been hungry for without knowing it. And he sat down beside the old rancher, and he listened, and after a long time, he began very softly to hum along. Caleb Quincy, 15 years old, in his round wire-frame glasses, sat next to his brother on the warm bench for most of those 5 days. He read aloud to him from a paperback copy of The Hobbit that Astrid lent him. He read all of it, beginning to end, in 5 days. Tobin listened. He had never been read aloud to in his entire life. On the evening of the 4th day, when Caleb was reading the part where Bilbo says goodbye to the elves, Tobin reached over and put his big, rough hand on top of his little brother's small one and squeezed once and let go. Caleb did not look up. He kept reading, but the page in front of him went blurry for a long minute. The storm broke on the morning of January 17th. The sun came up over the Sawtooth Peaks into a blue sky so clean and cold it hurt to look at. The wind dropped to nothing. The snow stopped. The whole valley lay buried beneath a smooth white blanket 12 feet deep in places, and the smoke from the few chimneys still burning rose straight up in thin gray lines. In the cave, the 23 people who had been sheltered there for 5 days began slowly to gather their things. Tobin Quincy on crutches, Lee Crowder had made him from 2 pieces of ash, hobbled to the entrance to look at the sky. His mother stood beside him, with one arm around his waist and Caleb tucked under the other. Early on the morning of the 17th, before the government sedans came up the road, a young man on snowshoes climbed the south slope alone. He was 24 years old, dark-haired, and his eyes were red-rimmed from 5 sleepless nights. He had spent the storm in his little house at the edge of town with a hammer and a kerosene lamp, beating the frozen pipes back to life every 2 hours, not knowing whether his young wife was alive or dead. He had run out of food on the 3rd day. He had eaten his last can of beans on the 4th. On the 5th, he had eaten nothing at all. His name was Daniel Reeves. When he stepped into the cave and saw Hannah sitting up on the warm bench with a small wrapped bundle in her arms, he did not speak. He crossed the cave in 4 long strides and dropped to his knees beside her, and he put his forehead against her forehead, and his shoulders shook without sound. Hannah opened the corner of the blanket so he could see the small pink face inside. "Daniel," she said, "meet your daughter." Daniel Reeves looked at the small face. He looked at his wife. He looked at the woman across the cave who had delivered his child in the dark of the worst night of his life. He could not get his voice to work. He just nodded over and over while the tears ran down his face into his beard. After a long moment, he stood up and walked over to Sigrid, who was banking the firebox. He took her good hand in both of his. He still could not speak. He brought her hand up to his forehead and held it there. Sigrid put her other hand, the one she could no longer fully feel, on the back of his bowed head, and she said very softly, "You are welcome, son." He nodded against her palm. He went back to his wife. Sigrid turned away and pretended to be busy with the firebox. Some moments are not for watching. If you have ever held a new baby in your arms and felt your whole heart go quiet, leave me a heart in the comments. There is no feeling like it on this side of heaven. And if you have ever watched someone you love hold a new baby for the first time, you know there are not enough words in the English language for what that does to a person. At 10 o'clock that morning, 3 black government sedans came up the mountain road as far as the road could be plowed, and 4 men in long wool overcoats got out and began walking the rest of the way up the south slope on snowshoes. The man in front was Sheriff Cyrus Whitlock. He was 50 years old, square-jawed gray at the temples, the kind of man who had been elected sheriff of Custer County 4 times in a row because he looked exactly the way a sheriff was supposed to look. The 3 men behind him were not from Custer County. 2 of them were attorneys from a development corporation out of Boise called Sawtooth Ridge Resort Holdings. The third was Cyrus Whitlock's older brother, Harlan Whitlock, 56 years old, the president of that corporation. They were carrying papers. The papers were a notice of condemnation and forcible eviction dated January 8, 1979, 3 days before the storm began. The notice claimed that the cave on the south face of Mount Wapiti was an illegal structure on federally administered land, that Sigrid Marston had no valid claim to the property, and that she had 48 hours to vacate the premises before her structures would be demolished. The notice was a lie. The land had been deeded to Sigrid's great-grandfather Henrik in 1909 as part of a homesteading patent, and the deed had passed cleanly down to Sigrid through her father. But the Whitlock brothers had been very quietly buying up every parcel on the south face of Mount Wapiti for 2 years, planning a luxury ski resort. Sigrid's claim was the last one standing in the way. Cyrus Whitlock had used his position as sheriff to slip his brother's eviction notice through the Custer County Recorder's office without proper review. He had timed the service for the week of the storm gambling that a widow alone on the mountain would simply give up. He had not counted on 23 witnesses. He had also not counted on Caleb Quincy. Sheriff Whitlock pulled back the canvas curtain at 10:14 that morning. He stepped inside, and the warmth of the cave hit him like a hand against the chest. 23 faces turned toward him. He cleared his throat. "Mrs. Marston," he began, "I have here a notice of Sheriff Caleb Quincy said." Caleb was sitting on the warm bench beside his mother. In his small hands, he was holding a Radio Shack cassette recorder, the kind that took 4 C batteries and ran on a single 90-minute tape. He had been carrying that recorder around for 3 years, taping interviews with old-timers for a school history project. His father had given it to him for his 12th birthday. Caleb pressed the play button. The voices on the tape were Cyrus Whitlock's and Harlan Whitlock's. They had been recorded at 6:30 that morning, when the 2 brothers had walked up to the cave entrance alone to look it over before the formal service of the eviction. They had stood just outside the canvas curtain, where they had thought no one could hear them, and they had spoken with the easy contempt of men who believed they had already won. The tape ran for 4 minutes and 17 seconds. It was enough. The tape clicked off. The cave was very still. Walter Hollister stood up from the bench. He was not a small man, and the blanket fell from his shoulders. He looked at Cyrus Whitlock the way a man looks at a snake he has just found in his grain shed. "Cyrus," Walt said. His voice was low. "I have voted for you 4 times. My wife has baked you a pie every Christmas for 16 years. You came to my mother's funeral." He took 1 step forward. "You get off this mountain. You get off it now. And you do not come back." Frank Delaney stood up beside Walt, then Lee Crowder, then Garrett Pemberton, his red hair still snow-white at the temples. 23 people stood up on the warm earthen bench of a widow they had laughed at for 18 months, and they faced the sheriff of Custer County in silence. Cyrus Whitlock looked at his brother. Harlan Whitlock would not meet his eyes. The sheriff turned without a word and walked back out into the snow. The two FBI agents who arrived in Cold Creek on March 19, 1979, would later play a transcribed version of that tape in front of a federal grand jury in Boise. Cyrus Whitlock was removed from office on April 2nd. He pled guilty to honest services fraud in October. Harlan Whitlock served 18 months in a federal facility in Lompoc, California. The Sawtooth Ridge Resort was never built. The south face of Mount Wapiti is still public forest today, and the cave is still there, and the trail to it is marked by a small wooden sign that reads simply, Marston Site, 1.8 miles. The snow began to melt in the second week of March. By April, the dirt roads of Custer County were passable again, and by May, the meadows along the Salmon River were green with new grass, and the bitterroot was blooming pink along the ditches. In the spring of 1979, 14 families in the Sawtooth Valley began construction on what came to be locally known as Sigrid houses. Small earth-sheltered structures cut into south-facing hillsides built around the principle of the Sedesdal bench. Sigrid Marston taught the technique for free to anyone who asked. Walter Hollister was her first student. He was 60 by then, and his knees were going, and he was a clumsy man with his hands. But he built a beautiful little root cellar at the back of his ranch house that held a steady 48 degrees year-round. He used it to age cheese. He called it the best thing he had ever made. His wife Eleanor used it for her preserves until the day she died in 2001. Their grandchildren still use it today. Last summer, they pulled a wheel of cheddar out of it that had been aging since 2017. Lee Crowder reopened his garage in the spring of '79 with Tobin Quincy as his apprentice. Tobin's leg healed clean. He walked with a slight limp for the rest of his life. He never minded it. He took over the garage from Lee in 1991 and ran it until he retired in 2015. His son named Daniel after Tobin's father runs it now. The bay where Tobin learned to read engine block diagrams from Lee still has the old hand-painted sign above it that Lee made for him in 1980. It reads simply, Tobin's Corner. Some things you do not paint over. Caleb Quincy graduated valedictorian of the Cold Creek class of 1981. He went to the University of Idaho on a full scholarship, then to MIT for his doctorate in mechanical engineering. In 1998, he published a paper in the Journal of Vernacular Architecture titled Thermal Mass and Air Gap Insulation in Norwegian American Cave Dwellings, a case study of the Marston Site, Custer County, Idaho. In that paper, he documented the cave's interior temperature measured continuously over 23 years, holding a steady 62 to 68 degrees Fahrenheit through Idaho winters that regularly reached 40 below. He calculated the cave's thermal performance at 2.4 times the efficiency of a standard insulated frame structure of the period. He dedicated the paper to his mother, his brother, and the woman who had carried him in from the storm. Rebecca Quincy lived another 36 years. She and her boys moved into a small house 2 streets over from Maggie Tollefson's general store in the summer of '79, and Rebecca went back to her old work as a nurse at the Sun Valley Hospital. She remarried in 1984, a kind widower named Henry Olson who had 3 grown children of his own and a soft spot for stray cats. She and Sigrid remained best friends until Rebecca's death from a stroke in the autumn of 2015. They had tea together every Wednesday morning for 36 years. They never missed one. At Rebecca's funeral, Sigrid stood up and said, "I went to nursing school with this woman in 1962, and I forgot her for 15 years, and a blizzard gave her back to me. And I will never forget her again." She sat back down, and Astrid held her hand. There was not a dry eye in the church. Maggie Tollefson sold her general store in 1981 and moved up the mountain into a small house Sigrid built for her on the cave property with a south-facing porch and a seat-style bench in the parlor. She lived there 9 years watching her granddaughter grow up. Astrid called her mormor, the Norwegian word for mother's mother. Maggie taught her to bake lefse and to braid her hair the old way, and to find the Pleiades in a cold winter sky. Maggie died peacefully in her sleep in the spring of 1990 at the age of 73. She is buried beside her son Eric in the Cold Creek Cemetery under a single piece of granite that reads simply, Marston. On the day of the funeral, Sigrid placed 3 things on top of the casket before they lowered it. A small wooden carving of a dog Maggie had whittled for Odin's 7th birthday, a seed packet of Brandywine tomatoes, and the folded triangle of the American flag the Navy had given Sigrid for Eric 15 years before. She had never opened the sealed envelope that came with it. She decided that morning that some things are meant to be carried, not read. Astrid Marston went to the University of Oregon, became an architect, and now runs a firm in Boise that designs earth-sheltered homes for low-income housing programs across the Mountain West. Over 140 families live in homes she has designed. She is 57 years old this winter. She has 3 children. The middle one is a boy named Bjorn. He just turned 9. He has his great-grandfather's pale gray eyes. And when he laughs, Astrid says he sounds exactly like the brother she never met. The brother in the photograph, the one who got there first. Sigrid Marston married Dr. Magnus Halvorsen, a Norwegian-American veterinarian from Twin Falls, in the autumn of 1985. He had come to the valley to treat a colicky horse at the Hollister Ranch, and had stayed for the woman who lived in the cave. They had 19 good years together. Magnus died of a heart attack in 2004. Sigrid lived another 3 years after that. She died on a quiet morning in March of 2007 in her own bed on the warm seat-style bench at the back of the cave with her daughter beside her and her great-granddaughter, a small blonde girl of 4 named Linnea, asleep in the crook of her arm. She was 66 years old. Her last words Astrid would say later were not words at all. She just smiled at something neither of them could see, and her breath went out, and she did not draw another one in. The morning sun was just touching the entrance of the cave when it happened. The grow lamps were warm. The trout were moving in slow circles in the pond. The photograph of the gap-toothed boy on the shelf was catching the first light of the day. It was, Astrid would say, the most peaceful death she had ever seen, and she has been a witness to many. Odin lived to be 12. He died peacefully in the autumn of 1988 on the warm earth of the bench, with Sigrid stroking the soft fur behind his ears. He had been her shadow for 9 years and 3 months. They buried him on the ridge above the cave, where the sun rises first in the morning, and Sigrid carved a flat piece of slate to mark the place. The carving read in Norwegian Trofast Vokter, faithful guardian. The stone is still there. Hikers leave small offerings sometimes, a pine cone, a flat river stone, a dog biscuit once. A child's hand-drawn picture of a German shepherd weighted down with a smooth white pebble, no name on it, no date. Just a child's drawing of a dog who had once known what to do. The cave on Mount Wapiti was placed on the National Register of Historic Places in 2015. It is now a Forest Service heritage site. Each summer, a few hundred visitors hike up the south slope to see it. Most of them are quiet when they go inside. The set-style bench is still warm in the winter. The trout pond is still clear. The grow lamps have been replaced with modern LEDs, but the spinach still grows. Volunteers from the Cold Creek Historical Society water it, On the small wooden shelf on the back wall behind glass, now the framed photograph of an 8-year-old boy with a gap-toothed smile still sits. Beside it, in a second frame, is a child's pencil drawing made in the spring of 1979. It shows 3 boys standing together under a sky full of stars. A blonde boy with a gap-toothed smile. A skinny boy with round wire frame glasses. A tall boy on crutches. Underneath, in 12-year-old Astrid Marston's careful handwriting, are 3 words. Brothers, all safe. This is the last interactive pause. And then I will let you go. If this story moved you, if it made you think of someone you love, or someone you have lost, do me one small favor. Light a candle tonight, just a small one, for the people who carried you in from your own storms, for the grandmothers who waited patiently across counters and across years until you were ready, for the dogs who knew before you did that someone needed help, for the quiet ones who built warm places against the dark while the world laughed at them. They are why any of us are still here. There is one more thing I want to tell you before we go. In the spring of 2022, a small ceremony was held at the Marston Cave. The National Park Service had agreed to add an interpretive plaque to the site in cooperation with the Cold Creek Historical Society and the local Sami American Heritage Association. Caleb Quincy, who was 58 years old then and a professor emeritus at MIT, flew out from Boston to speak. His brother, Tobin, 61, drove down from Stanley with his wife and 3 grown children. Astrid Marston was there with her 3 children, and her middle child, a small boy named Bjorn, was 7 years old then, and he read a short poem he had written in the cab of his mother's truck on the way up. The poem was about a dog who could hear the wind, and a woman who knew how to listen, and a cave that was full of light. Hannah Reeves was there with her daughter, Sigrid Hannah Lindgren, the baby born in the cave. Sigrid Hannah was 43 then. She is a pediatric nurse in Boise, just like her namesake. She brought her 4 children with her. Her youngest, a little girl, was 4 years old. She was named Astrid. Walt Hollister's grandson came. His grandfather had died in 2006. But he had told the story of the cave to every grandchild he had every Christmas for the rest of his life. He had told it badly, his grandson said. He had cried every time, but he had told it. Lee Crowder's son came. He runs the garage in Stanley now. Garrett Pemberton was there himself. He is 67. He moved back to Cold Creek in the 90s after his mother passed. He took care of her for the last 6 years of her life. He is a deacon in the Lutheran church. He sings in the choir. He has a voice that people drive across the county to hear at Christmas, though he claims he only learned to sing at 40, sitting in a cave during a blizzard, listening to Walt Hollister. Frank Delaney's granddaughter, Carol's daughter, was there. She is a forest ranger. She is the one who maintains the trail up to the cave. Caleb gave a short speech at the plaque dedication. He talked about thermal mass and air gap insulation briefly because he is a professor and that is what professors do. But then he stopped and he took off his round wireframe glasses and he polished them on the hem of his shirt and he said something different. He said I was 15 years old. I was dying. A woman I had never met carried me out of the snow into a warm room she had built with her own 2 hands. She gave my mother penicillin and saved her life. She crawled back into a 38 below blizzard at 1 in the morning to find my brother. She found him. She set his broken leg in the dark with her bare hands. She pulled him 3/4 of a mile uphill through the worst storm in the history of this county. And she lost the use of her left hand for almost a year doing it. She did all of that for a family she did not know, on a night when the rest of the world was laughing at her. He stopped. He put his glasses back on. The wisdom that built this cave came from a Sami village in northern Norway in the 19th century. It came down through 4 generations of one family. It was kept alive by a woman who, when she had lost everything that mattered to her in this world, sat down with her great-grandfather's drawings and decided that she was going to build a place where no one would ever have to die in the cold again. He looked at the crowd. He looked at his brother who was crying without sound the way men in their family had always cried. He looked at the photograph of the gap-toothed boy on the shelf behind the glass. He said, "You are looking at why I became an engineer. You are looking at why my brother walks with a limp. You are looking at why my niece is named Sigrid, and why her daughter is named Astrid, and why a little boy in Boise named Bjorn has eyes the color of January sky. You are looking at what one quiet woman can do with the knowledge her ancestors gave her and the courage to use it when nobody else thought she should." He stopped again. He took a long breath. He said, "In Norwegian there is a phrase my great-grandmother by marriage taught my mother to say to me when I was sick. Jorden husker varme. Stein glemmer ingenting. Earth remembers warmth. Stone forgets nothing." He stepped back from the microphone. The crowd was very quiet. A small wind moved through the pines on the ridge above the cave. Somewhere far off, a raven called. The sun came down through the trees in long gold bars. That was the spring of 2022. The plaque is still there. You can read it today if you ever find yourself on the south face of Mount Wapiti in Custer County, Idaho. It is a small bronze rectangle bolted to a granite boulder beside the cave entrance. The text on it was written by Caleb Quincy with help from his brother Tobin and from Astrid Marston. It does not say very much. It says only this: "In this place, in the winter of 1979, during the worst blizzard in the recorded history of central Idaho, Sigrid Marston, Navy veteran widow mother, opened her home to 23 of her neighbors and saved every one of them. The technique she used to build this shelter was brought to America in 1908 by her great-grandfather Henrik of the Setesdal Valley in Norway. It is offered here freely to anyone who needs it. Build into the bones of the land. The land will hold you up." Underneath in smaller letters are the names, all 23 of them, and one dog, Odin, faithful guardian. Wherever you are tonight, in whatever weather, in whatever season of your own life, may your fire be warm, and may your loved ones be near, and may the wisdom of those who came before you find you exactly when you need it most. May you have a friend like Maggie waiting patiently for you across some counter. May you have a daughter like Astrid who knows without being told when to put her arms around you. May you have a dog like Odin who hears the world before you do and runs toward whatever needs you most. And may you, when your own storm comes, find that someone has built a warm place for you in the dark, and that the door is open, and that there is room on the bench. Thank you for staying with me to the end of this one. If it touched your heart, take a moment to like this video and to subscribe to One Paw More. There are more stories like this one waiting for you. Stories of courage and loyalty and the small, quiet miracles that change everything. Stories about the kind of women the world does not often tell stories about. Stories for women like you who have been carrying warm places for other people your whole lives. Earth remembers warmth. Stone forgets nothing, and neither, my friend, do I.